Hey everybody, it's Alexander from the LSO, and it's now time to talk about my favorite piece of music in the world, Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky's Serenade for Strings. Now, of course, when I say my favorite piece of music in the world, I'm fibbing, because my favorite piece of music in the world is usually the piece of music that I happen to be thinking about or studying or performing at that moment. But I have to admit, Tchaikovsky's Serenade for Strings will always have a very special place in my heart. When I was 18 years old, the summer after I graduated from high school, I convinced and cajoled a group of my fellow high school music students here in Connecticut to come together and humor me, to allow me to conduct them in a chamber orchestra, a string orchestra concert of my own devising. I raised all the money for it myself. From the very beginning, I think I can say I was an entrepreneurial musician. I raised all the money for it myself. I hired out a beautiful church in our town, and on a beautiful summer evening, I conducted I think, fairly successful program. The very first piece was another serenade for strings, that of Sir Edward Elgar, which I hope we can someday do in one of our chamber orchestra concerts as well. But there was a gentleman in the audience. His name was Albert Markov. He was a recent emigre from the Soviet Union. This, of course, is back in the 1980s, when there were some very, some people in some very difficult situations. There were a lot of Russian Jewish people who were struggling to get out of the Soviet Union, and some of them managed to do so. And amongst them were some incredibly talented classical musicians. One of them is one of our favorite violin soloists at the La Crosse Symphony, our wonderful Yevgeny Kutik. Well, Albert Markov was another one of those Soviet emigres, and he came to my concert, unbeknownst to me, and he was suitably impressed. And the very next month, in August, I was engaged by him on a program in which, on the second half, his son, the incredibly gifted violinist Alexander Markov, who had recently won a major competition in France, would play Vivaldi's The Four Seasons, the great collection of Baroque violin concertos. And on the first half, I would conduct this professional string orchestra, which was made up of freelance professional musicians brought from kind of an area between New York and New Haven. I would conduct this little professional string orchestra in Tchaikovsky's Serenade for Strings. And I conducted it, and I was for this task, I was paid the fee of $500, and that was the beginning of my career. This is a piece I have loved from the days of my boyhood. I grew up on an old LP recording with the strings of the Boston Symphony Orchestra conducted. It was a record that dated from the 1950s that my parents had happened to have in the living room. It was a recording of the strings of the Boston Symphony Orchestra by their elegant Alsatian conductor, Monsieur Charles Munch, who is to this day one of my heroes as a conductor. Elegance and passion were his hallmarks. And anyway, I grew up on this recording, which if I played it for you now, would sound as if someone had dinner on it. I think I must have played it, 1,000 times. Had a beautiful cover. I miss the days of LP records, because the cover art, the program notes, it was all part of the experience. Anyway, I kind of was weaned on this piece by that recording. And so by the time Maestro Markov asked me to conduct this little orchestra of professional musicians in the Tchaikovsky Serenade, it was already second nature to me. It's a piece I've carried around with me ever since. I have conducted it everywhere I have had the privilege of working as a music director, and we actually performed this piece on a previous concert of the La Crosse Symphony Orchestra, but you probably wouldn't know that, because that was the concert that we were scheduled to have in April in 2 years ago, 3 years ago. It's all foggy memory now. It was in April. We were supposed to go up to Viroqua, and it was 2 years ago. We had that 2.5 years ago. We had that freak snowstorm, and the concert never happened. We ended up performing it in a little community church in downtown La Crosse, just for ourselves, and our faithful stage manager, Mr. Aaron Lewis, made a video recording of it. So we've never truly performed it for all of you, our wonderful, beloved audience in La Crosse, until now. So it's really kind of a blessing that we finally get to take this immortal, this gorgeous, late romantic, large-scale work. It's kind of a symphony in all but name by Tchaikovsky. It's like his symphony for strings. He calls it a serenade, which implies that it's very light, just kind of after dinner entertainment. But it's a very profound and beautiful work. It's such a thrill that we can finally present it for you. As I said, it's kind of a symphony in all but name, but not totally. It is in the 4 movements that you generally associate with a symphony, but with certain modifications. This, this Serenade for Strings comes from an endlessly fascinating time in Tchaikovsky's life and career. It dates from around the year 1880, when Tchaikovsky had managed to extricate himself from a profoundly ill-advised marriage to a rather unbalanced young woman who was one of his students at the Moscow Conservatory. Tchaikovsky was a gay person. Tchaikovsky was homosexual, and everyone who knew him knew that he was. And in his way, and there's a tradition of this in the arts, he was accepted for who he was, as long as he didn't make too much of a case out of it. Anyway, there was a very complicated set of emotions that led Tchaikovsky to come upon this really ridiculous idea of marrying this poor, misguided young woman who then kind of spent the rest of her life kind of hounding him. It was a terrible story, really, but Tchaikovsky had no one to blame but himself for getting himself into this situation. It was not the young woman's fault. It was Tchaikovsky's fault. He made this kind of mess himself. Anyway, he managed to extricate himself from this with the help of friends and his brother Modeste, and the musical expression of that profound personal angst is, to this day, known to us as his Symphony Number 4. It's a work that we did in my very first season as your music director, and I know that in the coming years we will get to it again. It's one of the most favorite all-time works. It's like the Beethoven 5 of the Tchaikovsky symphonies, where, like Beethoven in his 5th symphony, Tchaikovsky deals with his own personal fate. He writes about this in letters and diaries extensively, that this is his own way of working out his own personal fate as just a mere mortal like the rest of us. Anyway, the composition and performance of the 4th Symphony of Tchaikovsky was truly an emotional catharsis for him. And then for the next few years, Tchaikovsky didn't write any symphonies. There's a huge gap of about almost a decade between the composition of his 4th Symphony and his equally immortal 5th Symphony. In the years in between, he took a kind of musical vacation in which he wrote all of these other kinds of works that were not quite symphonies. He left us 4 orchestral suites, not symphonies, but orchestral suites, which to this day remain one of the most beautiful and fascinating corners of the 19th century repertoire. I've actually conducted all 4 of them with my wonderful other orchestra in Wisconsin, in Waukesha County. They're beautiful, really strange works. They're kind of a halfway house between the Germanic rigors of a symphony and Tchaikovsky's favorite kind of music, the delight and lightness and spontaneity of music for the ballet. Let us never forget, Tchaikovsky is the man who left us the Nutcracker, the Sleeping Beauty, and Swan Lake. And his orchestral suites are kind of a kind of a modus vivendi between those two very different worlds. The world of the symphony being very Germanic, the world of the ballet music, of course, being French. Well, the Serenade for Strings is another hybrid work. He wrote it. It's so incredibly weird that he wrote it basically. You know how great composers basically they often write two major works at once, like two parallel trains running. Well, it was in the year 1880 that Tchaikovsky, in a famous letter to his publisher Jorgensen, said that I've just written two works. One of them is a total potboiler called the 1812 Overture that people are going to love, but I hate it. But then there's this other work I wrote that is very dear to my heart. I call it a Serenade for String Orchestra, and I really hope you're going to love it. It was first performed later that year by students at the Moscow Conservatory, and it was an instant success. As I've been saying, this Serenade for Strings in C major, that brightest of keys, no sharps, no flats, it's an almost symphony for strings. The first movement is, all of the tempo markings are Italian. Tchaikovsky always gave his pieces, all the movements of all the pieces he wrote, Italian tempo markings. That was Russian composers, Russians in general are, they're part European, they're part not European. And Tchaikovsky, showing his cosmopolitan nature, gave all of his tempo markings in Italian. And the tempo marking of the first movement is called, it's my favorite first movement in history. I just love saying it in Italian. It's marked pezzo in forma di sonatina, which means piece in the form of a sonatina. Sonatina, Italian for little sonata. The sonatina form was the favorite form of some of Mozart's overtures, and especially the early 19th century Italian bel canto opera composers. You know, those guys like Rossini and Bellini and Donizetti, and they would write their overtures in sonatina form, which is a sonata form, exposition, development, recapitulation, with the rigorous development section cut, so you don't have to tax your audience. So Tchaikovsky writes his first movement in the kind of Mozart-Rossini form of a sonatina, and it's utterly perfect. It has this opening idea of a descending scale of 3 notes, which is magnificent and unforgettable. The second movement, which it's always in a symphony, the second or third movement, depending on the composer's taste, is a dance movement. And this time Tchaikovsky, of course, in his cosmopolitan bent, gives us one of his most beautiful essays in the form of a waltz. Now remember, in the Fourth Symphony, Tchaikovsky, and this was something that had never been done before ever, Tchaikovsky made a waltz the main idea of the first movement. And boy, was that in sonata form, of the very gravely rigorous Symphony No. 4. No one had ever used a waltz as the main idea of a symphony. It just wasn't done. The waltz was a form of popular music in the middle 19th century. Anyway, Tchaikovsky here gives us a waltz free of all rigor and angst. It's just a delicious kind of souffle of a piece. Things get very serious in the slow movement, marked Larghetto Elegiaco, an elegy for strings. This is a movement of the most heartfelt nostalgia. It's really where a conductor has to prove their ability to get a lyrical sense from the orchestra, a real sense of melody, a long sense of line. It builds to a heartbreaking climax and then subsides in kind of a sense of profound melancholy. The finale, Tchaikovsky says, tema russo in Italian. It's a finale based on a Russian theme. It is we are told, a hauling song, as we are in La Crosse and the banks of the Mississippi. We would not be allergic to that. It's a boatman's song. The men who, you remember this from the, the history of the Mississippi, there would be men who would haul a boat down a river. And this is a song that was sung back in the day by the men who would help haul boats down the Volga. It's once again based on those three falling notes, the dee da da da, and it's actually four falling notes, the dee da da da, and it's at that moment that you suddenly realize that Tchaikovsky has used that little melodic germ of those four, that descending scale of four little notes. It's from this little Volga boatman's song that Tchaikovsky built the grand, magnificent structure of the opening movement, that glorious opening theme. It's a trick only a genius could pull off. And Tchaikovsky's Serenade for Strings, while maybe being not truly a symphony in its academic form, really is a work for the ages. And I cannot wait to share it with you on stage at Viterbo. Here is a beautiful performance from about 30 years ago, another great conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra that I had the privilege of studying with at Tanglewood back in the day as a conducting fellow, the great Japanese conductor Seiji Ozawa, conducting an orchestra of his proteges and students.